As the call to worship, I am going to quote excerpts from an interview in Psychology Today with Cheryl Paul. Cheryl Paul is a Jungian counselor, teacher, and the best-selling author of the book, The Wisdom of Anxiety. And here is some of what she says. We can view pain of all kinds, physical, emotional, spiritual, as a messenger offering an opportunity to grow and heal. Or we can see anxiety through the lens that we're being tortured or punished, or that it's evidence of brokenness. One is a lens of hope and even gratitude, and one is a lens of shame. Our symptoms are so wise, our bodies are so wise. Just as our physical pain response tells us to pay attention, so anxiety invites us to wake up. We live in these extraordinary bodies and psyches that will guide us toward well-being if only we could slow down long enough and find the courage to listen. What needs attention will differ for everyone, but there will always be wisdom and guidance that emerge when anxiety is approached through the lens of curiosity and compassion. When we take care of our bodies, learn to respond to our thoughts effectively, meet our emotions with compassion, and connect to a consistent spiritual practice, anxiety lessens. So here ends the lesson from Cheryl Paul. Our spiritual life can reduce our anxiety. And reducing our anxiety enables our spiritual life to deepen. And the result of both reduced anxiety and deepened spiritual life is that we are better able to change the world in ways that make it less anxiety-provoking. So let us worship together the Spirit that is still at work today, as it was in ages past, to free us and lead us through anxious times toward the realm of God's love and peace on earth. So we don't have children with us in terms of age, but counting on us all being young at heart, I'm going to treat you all as children and deliver this message. So good morning.
Good morning.
Jesus was human. Jesus was human. He had feelings. You know, we don't think about this maybe very often, but he had feelings. And so did his followers. They felt love, and joy, and peace, but they also felt fear and grief and anxiety. And there are two gospel stories that show this that I really appreciate. The first took place on Maundy Thursday. Jesus knew that powerful people were trying to kill him. And he went out on a hill overlooking Jerusalem called the Mount of Olives to a garden called Gethsemane. And he fell to his knees there and he prayed. He prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." In other words, I don't want to get arrested and killed, but if it is what I need to do in order to serve you, then I am willing. And after he prayed that, the story says that an angel appeared and gave him strength. He was still, it didn't take away his anguish. He was still suffering. He was sad, he was lonely, he was anxious and afraid. And he prayed again so hard that the story in Luke says that his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. You see, everyone gets upset sometimes, and it's okay to wish that things were different and pray for that. But at the same time, it is important to accept that what we are anxious about may need to happen, and to trust enough to say, not my will, but thy will be done. That welcoming prayer can work miracles and give us the strength we need. It can also calm us to be more creative in our thinking, and we may find a way to get out of the anxious situation. The second story is about Easter night. So 3 days later, the disciples were hiding in a house with the doors locked, anxiety off the charts, afraid of being arrested and killed as Jesus had been, and also anxious about the story that they had heard of Jesus rising from the dead, a ghost story, really. And then, all of a sudden, Jesus was there with them in that locked room. And they thought he was a ghost, and they freaked out more. But Jesus told them, "Peace be with you." And he was saying it almost as a command, or a word of power to help change their state of mind. Jesus breathed on them, the story says. He breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." And then he sent them out into the world to do the same work that he had done. So it's natural to be so anxious sometimes that we want to hide and not risk doing the work that Jesus calls us to do. But Jesus will come through our locked doors and give us peace so that we can open to the Spirit and go back out to make this world a loving, healthy, fair place for all. It helps us open to that, do that, if we do what Jesus did in the Garden of Gethsemane, because that action that he did unlocks the doors of our heart and opens us to the Spirit. And I bet you can't imagine what that is. Pray. Thank you. So we are going to pray, and we are alternating versions of the Lord's Prayer from week to week. Let us pray together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. So thank you, Deidre, for suggesting that we have this conversation together. So I'm going to just begin with just by asking you a question. Deidre, from your pastoral perspective as a chaplain and as a spiritual director, do you see signs that these are particularly anxious times? You've been a pastor for a long time. You've been.
Yeah.
I mean, you're very young, so you started.
Yes, I'm very young, right? But somehow it's been decades. So, yes, I've been a pastor for a long time. So, are these particularly anxious times? Yes and no. So, in my spare time, I've been spending a lot of time in the 17th century, and there was plenty of anxiety then. With the Protestant Reformation really coming into its own and settling, white people coming into this land and everything that unfolded there, and religious wars, and there was plenty of anxiety then too. Maybe some of us are noticing it more than we have in the past because it's affecting us in a way maybe that we've escaped. So the answer is yes and no. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really valuable to remember that this is not the first anxious time. It is an anxious time. I mean, we last week when we went to all Zoom, we did it out of kind of a collective anxiety about the pandemic, and certainly there are so many other things going on in the world that make us anxious. The smoke in the air. We're breathing anxiety. And statistically, whether it's because now we're looking for anxiety or whether it's actually increasing, but we do find there are more and more people being diagnosed with anxiety disorders. It's always been this way. So how do you help people work through, in your work, as chaplain and as spiritual director and as pastor in the past, how do you help people work through their anxiety?
So, number one is that I have to work on myself. So I learned ages ago that if I show up, say at a patient's door, and I am not grounded myself, that visit's not going to go well. I have to be centered, and then I have to be willing to set aside whatever anxiety I have, because coming to a person you don't know in a very anxious situation is anxiety producing. So we could just trade anxiety all the livelong day. So I have to somehow set that aside and then be curious about what I'm going to encounter. That said, I'm going to turn my attention to the table. Over the years, I have become pro-props. So, first of all, I love candles, and I used to be a snob about these battery-operated things, thinking this is just not the real deal. But I've been in plenty of places where flames are not allowed. So I've had to learn to use these, and one of the things I've learned is you can hold a light in your hand. And there's something very comforting about that. And these little tea lights, if I scatter them around a room, one of the things I do with our staff is that I transform a conference room about once a month into a meditative space, and we call it Tea for the Soul. And I turn down all the lights, and I light with these kinds of lights, and it totally transforms the place. And people who are working in a medical center, which is a petri dish of anxiety, can come in for a few moments to a quiet space where there's some soft music playing and soft lighting, where there's tea and some snacks and some objects to engage with. So we just heard really beautiful readings from Danette. And so one of the things is the words that are comforting to people. So that's why I have a Bible here, or any book of poetry that's important to people or particularly dear to their hearts, or other sacred works. We pray the Lord's Prayer every Sunday. I had a patient once who called for a chaplain. Actually, the nurse called for a chaplain because she was in over her head. There was a patient who wanted to pray the Lord's Prayer, and she didn't know the words. And so she needed a chaplain. And I thought, all right, I'm going to come in and pray the Lord's Prayer. Well, we prayed the Lord's Prayer for about 20 minutes. My back was hurting, my feet were hurting because it was hard to understand what he really wanted. All he wanted was somebody to say the words with him, and it became a mantra. So while we might pray the words, with thinking about the meaning, it can also be a mantra. About 20 years ago, I was on a New Jersey Transit train, and there was an accident that slowed all the traffic down. And of course, when you're on New Jersey Transit, you're either going to work, and so you've got a deadline, or you're trying to catch a plane. So the train kept filling up because passengers were diverted from other trains, and it slowed down, and we were all crowded. And through in my line of vision was a woman who reminded me of the elder women in my tradition. I come from a Czech family. And she right down to the coat, she was hunched over, and she had this headscarf and a big Mary Poppins bag. And out of that bag, she pulled her rosary. And she sat there, closed her eyes, rocked back and forth, and prayed that rosary over and over. And I could almost hear the Our Fathers and the Hail Marys. And that was when it finally hit me how important these kinds of tangible things with spiritual traditions are for people. I have some mala beads here too. I don't know where I got them or how I got them, but I know they're mine. And I don't really know how to use them, but sometimes I bring those to the room as well. Rocks, the things that you can find in nature. My husband is the soul of patience because he knows every time we go to a river or a shore, I'm going to come back with rocks. We have a rule now, no more than you can carry. Lots of times I'll take these rocks to the tea room, and people stand there and make things out of them, and then they walk away. And somehow it's a calming exercise for them. Icons. I hadn't totally paid attention to what the readings were going to be. I'd forgotten about the Jeremiah reading, about the rootedness. And so this, I think the artist is Jan Richardson, and I picked this for today. I have so many Marys and angels, but this one seems neutral, more kind of tradition neutral. So the rootedness and the leaves and the sun and the moon, and it's hard to see, but these are human beings on the branches. So I find sometimes just getting out of our heads and contemplating an icon, which is a spiritual tradition in itself. And then, let's see, I have cards to go too. So this is actually a card from the Mark reading we heard. This is Jesus in the boat in the storm. I have a whole stack of these that I don't necessarily bring the Christian cards, but a lot of times I'll bring art cards to the room. And finally, something that's my folks think is practically a miracle, and that is dissolving paper. So we have these little slips of paper, and you can write anything you want on the paper. You stick it in water, swirl it around, and it dissolves. It's a variation on, you can burn a piece of paper, or if you read The Secret Life, I think it's The Secret Life of Bees, there was a character who was very sensitive, and every time there was bad news, she absorbed it. And what she did was she would take a piece of paper and she would write down these horrible things and go down to the river and stick it in the bank, in the rocks, or in the water, or I think she had a wall she stuck it in. And when I read that, I started doing that, and then I discovered the paper. So all of these things are things that help us, I think. I've seen it anyway. It helps me. And I've seen people actually just come from a very anxious place here. I watch them come right down and become much more grounded. A lot of times there are tears, laughter, but I see them walk into this room and then walk out again, having taken a breath. So those are just some of the things that.
Yeah, it reminds me of what Cheryl Paul wrote that I quoted. That we need to be able to to learn how to deal with our thoughts and our feelings. I mean, we need to be trained. I mean, one thing she talks about in her book is that we should be, teaching our children how to, equipping ourselves with tools so that we know how to do this. And there are so many. We live in a really we're amazingly blessed in this time by all the different wisdom. On this table, there are, ancient things here. I mean, rocks. People have been doing this little, sculpture of rocks for how long, and icons, and scriptures that are 3,000 years old. But we also have today cognitive behavioral therapy. We have we've taken the ancient contemplative tradition of mindfulness and meditation and really become scientific with it and developed centering prayer and heartfulness in the Christian tradition. And there are all kinds of other therapies that are just so useful. So I guess this brings me to my another question, which is just to think about the forecast is for more anxiety. Anxiety's always been in the forecast, maybe now more than ever. What changes could we make as a society or as a church to help us get through anxious times ahead? How could we be educating or equipping ourselves to do that?
I think we're fortunate in that I think there's a new level of awareness. So, like you, I went to seminary, and then I worked at my seminary for about a decade. And never was there the kind of care for staff that I see these days, and even in my work setting now. Suddenly, that's come to the fore even a little more. People are beginning to recognize that we are in a very, very anxious place, and it's probably not going to change soon, but I think, as you were saying, we've got more tools. And as you always point out to us in the Heartfulness Circle that if we are tending ourselves, that's contributing to a common good. I've seen for years, we talked about this earlier, when I read for the first time that anxiety is an energy unto itself, and it travels from person to person. It can actually lodge. It'll especially lodge in the leader, or it will lodge in somebody who is particularly vulnerable in the group. I had an experience once where I was the leader, and I knew this group was anxious, and we just kind of would go through this loop over and over and over again. And then I read that, and I was a little more aware. And in this particular meeting, I was detached enough to watch the anxiety start to rise, and I could feel it in my body, as you pointed out, and I almost felt it coming up through the floor. I mean, this sounds really crazy, but I was really grateful because I could say, no, I'm not taking that anxiety, and I could stand back and be more calm. And I think we can't fix other people's anxiety, but we can do something about our own. And I think a calm demeanor, a more centered, coming from a more centered place helps to balance the energy in the room and interpersonally.
Absolutely. It's the old Taoist saying that goes through, no peace in the world without peace in the nation, no peace in the nation without peace in the town, no peace in the town without peace in the home, no peace in the home without peace in the heart. So, that's really where it all begins. And I like to think of that old saying, don't just sit there, do something. Don't just do something, sit there and get yourself centered and use whatever technique comes to you. Well, thank you, Deidre. I guess at this point I'd like to open it up to and we can turn on the TV and invite the Zoom participants to join us. The question that we're all addressing here is, what can we do to get ourselves through anxious times? What can we do to get ourselves through anxious times? What spiritual or psychological wisdom helps us or helps you to be less anxious and helps reduce the anxieties of others around us or around you? So what do you do? What's your experience? What are your reflections on this? And just raise your hand if you have a thought and you'd like to share. I'm thrilled to introduce my sister-in-law, Debbie.
I am a PE teacher, and so what works best for me and what I try to teach the young children in the elementary school where I work is to get outside and to find whatever physical movement in nature. For me, it's walking. I walk for hours, and up here in Vermont, it's a complete and different environment and a gift to notice the beauty around you and slow your mind down.
Ditto, really. I mean, exactly what you said. And just to add that it's important to remember that we're a system, right? And so we can think about our spiritual life, and we can think about our psychological life, and our physical life, and they are all connected. And so, yes, when you get out and walk, it really helps your psychological state. And for me, getting out into nature is really good, because again, we're all part of this larger system, which of course can cause more anxiety because we're contributing negatively to that larger environment. But getting out into nature and walking helps.
I was going to save this for joys and concerns. I didn't know anxiety, that anxious times was the theme today. And I have a joy. If you hold that, it's easier for me. I have a problem which causes me anxiety. And I wrote this poem in the morning. I said a prayer before I went to bed at night, but when I wrote the poem, I forgot I'd written the prayer. But this is the poem I wrote, Window, as I had an experience during the night. In my sleep, the image of a window, light rain falling softly, a moment of beauty, a perfect stillness as I slept. It's like the peace of God which passeth all understanding. Monday is the X-ray of my left hip. It means I need not worry. Whatever the outcome, I shall go on, open to the Spirit. Once I said to another, but I don't see the wine flowing or the roses. She replied, but you do see a window into the meaning of your life.
I think for me, one of the things that for stress and anxiety in my life that I try to think about is perspective. Because in college, you were stressed out about a final exam, and it's like, oh gosh, that's nothing. And in terms of like pandemic stress, and this is a personal reflection, I hope that's okay. In terms of pandemic stress, like last year, we all had to go home because we were all afraid of each other and getting each other sick. And that meant that the busyness of my life and having 2 teenage children, it changed. So the stress of having to get them from A to B to C to D and everywhere in between, I didn't have that anymore. So I could be at home and just have more peace in my heart because I didn't have to go anywhere. It really appealed to the introvert in me.
Yeah, so finding, I mean, designing a life, finding our natural habitat, thinking about how we, what we do and what we don't do, what we can control, what we can't. And looking for those gifts, looking for those moments. I mean, I think of like creating an oasis, like saying, okay, that's what the Sabbath was. The Sabbath was an oasis where you did not do all the running around. You didn't do the work. You created this little palace of unanxious time. And so thank you.
I think for me, one of the most important things is recognizing the anxiety, because if I don't know that that's what I'm feeling, then I can't do any of the other things to address it. So being able to recognize it then gives me more control over my reactions and find a way to help lessen it. But I'm not always so good at recognizing it.
Which is where mindfulness not only helps us reduce our anxiety, but it also helps us be aware of it too.
I think that's very true, recognizing it. And then for me, I would echo all these things that people have said, but also say that breaking things down to little steps that I can picture myself doing helps me cope with whatever it is I'm anxious about.
Yeah, I remember the story of a woman who was going to adopt her first child, and she was so anxious, but she said to herself, okay, I can walk to the car. I can open the car door and sit down. And just that, I mean, really helped her. That's how she got there.
I'm just going to be honest here. And I exercise, I go outside sometimes, and that helps. But one of my go-to anxiety relieving tools since I was probably 7, and my sister can testify to this, is baking. And I just like stress, it's a baking therapy thing. So if I happen to send you an email or call and say, hey, would you like a cake? Or can I feed you somehow? Be aware that you're part of the therapeutic community that's helping me with my anxiety. Thank you.
Place orders. Plenty of anxiety ahead.
Yes to everything everyone has said, and the thing that I also do is breathe. That's kind of the first thing I do now. What Amber said is I can often recognize it, and then I love that 4-7-8 breathing. So it's 4 breaths in, hold it for 7, and exhale for 8. And then I've learned recently that breathing in through the nose is neurologically calming, which I think is so interesting, because when we breathe through our mouths, so PE teacher, we breathe through our mouths when we're exercising, running, but that can trigger in our bodies more of a fight or flight feeling, because it's and so breathing through our nose is more calming. So I really love all the body-brain research about anxiety, and I think learning about all that has also helped me. I just find it really fascinating. So
I feel a bit foolish because I keep talking about my dog, but I find great peace when I pick him up and hold him and make him feel when he breathes deeply, because I'm patting him or rubbing him. And in a sense, I think it's because I can't control much of anything else lately. And I certainly can't control what's going on in the family. But what I can do is pick up this little creature and just hold him and rub him. And somehow I just feel my whole metabolism calming down. So to those of you who have puppies, I highly recommend that. Do you want to say something?
Anxiety. Well, I guess when things seem precarious to me, for one reason or another, I try to think of the times when I was loved, when I've experienced love from other people. And it lifts me up in a way that, what bad could happen? Just that's about all I can put it. It's very complicated.
Right. I think it's complicated, but it's also simple and profound. Yeah, to think.
This is partially related. I certainly agree with many of the comments that I have heard and some of the wisdom that I think has been forward in terms of anxiety. But I have a memory of decades ago when I had a particular situation I was attempting to deal with that I found very troubling and very worrisome. And I think I was very anxious about. And I had expressed that to an individual who happened to be living next door to me. And his comment to me was, Ken, he was probably 20 years my senior and a man I had quite a bit of respect for. He said, Ken, you need to remember that 80% of the things we worry about never happen. And that has always stayed with me. And in that particular instance, the thing I had worried about for 3 or 4 or 5 days prior to that particular afternoon never occurred and never happened. So I have found that to be something when I get real anxious about things, to think about, well, now, is this real? Is it really going to happen? Or how much of this have I conjured up in my mind? I'm not sure that's a direct answer to the question about what can we do to get ourselves through anxious times. But one of the things that I love to do, and I don't mean to speak for Marcia, but I know she enjoys it also, is we love to go down and sit by our pond and have the sun beating down on us in a nice day and watch the red-winged blackbirds fly in and out of the nearby bushes. And the tree swallows and the way they fly and the patterns that they have and how they scoop into the water and almost wash themselves a little bit and scoop back up again. And the bluebirds, and watch the families as they move into some of our houses and grow. And I think I find that very, very comforting and very settling. And it also brings me back to the basics of nature and what God has given us and the existence of it. And so much that we worry about is so minuscule compared to what's happening around us from that point of view.
I have not been very successful in my life of getting rid of my anxieties. And when I've tried to do all the things that you've all suggested, and it's still there, okay, I have a couple of techniques. One of them that I think I've mentioned before was given to me by my mother, which was stop fretting, get busy, and wash the floor or do something like that. I also tried very hard to turn that anxiety into something positive that gives me pleasure in helping somebody else. And I can I can turn that anxiety around if I refocus on giving and loving. But then there come those nights when I simply cannot shut my mind off. And I listen to books and tape. I have the company of good thoughts of somebody else, whatever it is I want to do or read, or what I've been studying, or it may be a book of poetry that gets read to me. I think that comes from the times when I was a child. My mother always read to us as children, and we read to our children out loud. So that voice in the background before you go to sleep seems to be helpful. And my mind stops rattling around in this cage. So thank you for all your thoughts. They're wonderful. They're just wonderful. Thank you for this moment of sharing.
Thank you so much for, I mean, I asked, what can we do? And here it is. I mean, the collective wisdom is astounding. Thank you so much.